So this is the key to understanding, you guys, why Islam is still violent today. People are like, well, is it violent? Is it peaceful? Like world leaders say it's peaceful, but you see all the violence and stuff on the news and things like that, right? So how do we understand that it is violent today, and how do we explain that to other people, right? And so that's the key. That's what I'm going to explain to you right here. And it's very simple, but once you understand this, it makes perfect sense, right? But if you don't understand it, you could read the Quran and be completely confused about it, right? So here we go. This is the key. It's called abrogation. Okay, so to abrogate means to replace one thing with another thing that came along later, right? So in the Quran, the Quran as of today is compiled from the longest book to the shortest book. Okay? It's not compiled as it happened throughout history, like the Bible. It's not in chronological order. Okay? So in Islam, in the Quran, Muhammad was peaceful in the earlier parts of his life when he lived in Mecca, right? And then later on, he became a violent warlord when he lived in Medina. He became rich, he became powerful, he became a violent warlord, right? And this is the key. The passages in the Quran that were written later historically abrogate the ones that were written earlier historically, right? And so when you see something come up first in the Quran, when you open it in the first surah, right, the first chapter, that the Quran is written from longest book to that's how it's compiled, from longest book to shortest book, not historically, right? So you'll never be able to tell what abrogates what until you understand like how it happened throughout history, right? And historically, Muhammad was peaceful in the beginning of his life and he was violent later on in his life. So all of the violent verses abrogate the earlier peaceful verses, right? But you have to know how it happened in history, right? So the Quran today, like we'll say this, the last chapter of the Quran that was written was chapter 9, Surah 9, okay? And Surah 9 is the most violent one. So later, Surah 9 was written the last in history, near the end. It must have been at the end of Muhammad's life or near the end of Muhammad's life, right? So that one abrogates all of the earlier verses, right? But doesn't mean it's the last chapter in the Quran, right? It's probably near the middle, right? I think there's a lot of chapters in the Quran, right? So this is Surah 9, so this is somewhere near the beginning, right? Okay, so Surah 9 was written last, and Surah 9 is full of violence. It's probably one of the most violent chapters, okay? So I'm going to give you some of the verses out of Surah 9. Surah 9:5 is the verse of the sword, right? It says, when the sacred months are over, this is quotations, quote, when the sacred months are over, kill the mushrikun wherever you find them, right? Unquote. I kind of shortened it there, but so mushrikun are the polytheists, right? That's probably modern day Trinitarians or anybody that thinks there's more than, you know what I mean? It's mushrikun. It says, kill the mushrikun wherever you find them when the sacred months are over, right? And the mushrikun are, by definition, polytheists, idolaters, and pagans, and anyone who does not accept the oneness of Allah, right? So that includes Christians, right? We believe in one God, three persons, right? So, or make them pay the tax, right? So it's saying kill all the other religions, anyone they deem pagan, anyone who doesn't accept the oneness of Allah. It's saying kill them or make them pay the tax, right? And that's what I was talking about before. Those are your three options: become a Muslim, pay the tax, or die, right? So that's exactly what Surah 9:5 says, right? Surah 9:29 says, fight against those who do not believe in Allah and those who do not acknowledge the religion of truth, right? So that's when it's talking about the religion of truth, it's saying those who do not acknowledge Islam, right? And then among the people of the scriptures, the Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya and feel themselves subdued, right? So it's straight up saying fight against those who do not believe in Allah and who do not acknowledge the religion of truth, which is Islam, among the people of the scriptures, the Jews and Christians, right? So, it says to fight until they pay the jizya and feel themselves subdued, right? And then so Surah 9:111 says, die killing as a martyr is the only way, like, for assurance of salvation in Islam, right? To die killing as a martyr is the only way to assurance of salvation in Islam, right? And then elsewhere it talks about as they die for Islam, they die and they get to be with all these voluptuous black-eyed beauties, right? Like, I think it's like there's a whole bunch of them waiting for them up there, right? And that alone, I don't have the exact verse number quoted for that, but I know it's somewhere, right? Islam teaches that, right? And that alone is disgusting, right? Like, teaching men to die for Islam, and then they'll have all these black-eyed beauties, houris, I think they call them, in heaven, right? Like, using their hormones and stuff to deceive them into becoming a jihad bomber or something, right? Like, that's just, it's sick, right? And so hopefully, does that all make sense with the abrogation stuff? Abrogation means when something comes along later in history, it replaces the earlier stuff, right? And the Quran is written from longest chapter to shortest chapter, so it won't make sense when you read it from beginning to end unless you know which surahs were written later in history, right? And so, because the ones written later in history abrogate the ones that were written earlier, right? And Surah 9 was written last in history. So Surah 9 abrogates everything else. And Surah 9 has some of the most violent verses in the entire Quran, right? If not the most. I haven't compared, but it has some of the most, right? For sure. Okay. So, I'm going to give you one more example of abrogation here. This is one that's really common. A lot of people quote this too. Like, a lot of people say, the Quran says, let there be no compulsion in religion, right? Like, don't ever force your religion on somebody else, right? But that was abrogated by the verse of the sword, Surah 9:5, which is clear to, when the sacred months are over, kill the mushrikun wherever you find them, right? And that's talking about Christians, right? So, there's a couple more verses I wanted to go over here, just that's the abrogation part though, right? If you understand what I just said, that is how we understand today that Islam is still violent, and that's how we explain it to people, right? We just have to understand the abrogation part, and that Surah 9 was written last, okay?